Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
If you haven't heard it yet, welcome to 2025. Let's hope it's a great year for the National Park Service, the National Park System, and for all of us adding to the list of parks we visited. Hi, this is Kurt Repanshek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. We're 5 days into 2025, and already there's lots of news concerning national parks and the National Park Service to discuss. Joining me today for that conversation is contributing editor Kim O'Connell, who's been staying busy with park-related stories on hurricanes, invasive species, to help with Traveler's 4th annual Threatened and Endangered Park Series. I'll be back in a minute with Kim to bring you up to date on all things park-related.
Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life, full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Hi, Kim. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, before we get into the Threatened and Endangered Park Series, there was late-breaking news in the very end of 2024. On New Year's Eve, the state of Montana filed a lawsuit against the Interior Department, Yellowstone National Park, Park Service Director Chuck Sams, Yellowstone National Park Superintendent Cam Shawley, trying to stop the bison management plan that Yellowstone adopted last summer. Montana Governor Greg Gianforte says that, quote, the National Park Service has repeatedly and consistently failed to engage with the state in a meaningful and transparent manner as required by law throughout the planning process. The National Park Service has not given us a fair shake and has ignored concerns raised by the state. We will always defend our state from federal overreach, end quote. Now, there are a couple of interesting things about this lawsuit, Kim. Montana officials have long been at odds with Yellowstone over bison and how they're managed, and since 2022 at least have voiced concerns over how bison are managed by the park. Driving those concerns is brucellosis. Now, that's a disease that can cause livestock, particularly cattle, to abort their fetuses, and in a state that depends heavily on the ranching industry like Montana, it can be devastating if brucellosis spreads through private cattle herds in that state. Now, what's interesting is while Montana officials fear that bison will transmit brucellosis to cattle herds in their state, back in 2017, I think it was, the National Academies of Science came out with research that said that elk, not bison, are most likely to transmit brucellosis to cattle. Of course, elk hunting in Montana is also a profitable business, and so I guess the state doesn't want to reduce hunting opportunities by getting rid of elk. Also interesting is that Yellowstone Superintendent Cam Shawley back in July wrote the governor to address his state's concerns. Shawley went on to address other issues raised by the state, and we'll lay them out on the Traveler in an upcoming story. Suffice to say that bison are controversial in Montana and figure to become more controversial in that state, not only because of Yellowstone's bison herds, but because the Blackfoot tribe in northeastern Montana, bordering Glacier National Park, has a bison herd of its own and wants to grow that herd. And there are efforts to allow bison from the Blackfoot Reservation to wander into Glacier National Park next door. So if the governor is worried about Yellowstone bison, he's going to have more to worry about in the months and years to come. Never a dull story in Montana.
That's really interesting. And I'm hinging on your comment about the studies showing that the elk are the bigger concern. But what is the nature, like, have there been scientific studies or, about the extent to which brucellosis is impacting Montana herds? Like, does anyone have a handle on percentages or numbers or anything like that?
To the best of my knowledge, it has not been documented, brucellosis case being transmitted to cattle. I could be wrong on that, but they have documented it with elk, and so that's an issue. Now, in his letter, Superintendent Shawley back in July told the governor that they plan to maintain a population range that allows for spatial separation between bison and cattle outside the park, resulting in 0 brucellosis transmissions to this so far. And the plan the park adopted also supposedly will boost economic spending in surrounding Montana communities and improve visitor experiences. So it's going to be interesting how this all plays out, what the Park Service legal response will be to the Montana suit. But never a dull moment with Yellowstone National Park.
Yeah, no break ever when it comes to park news. So
Never.
I know you and I were in touch with each other throughout this holiday break because there really isn't a chance to put down the pen or step away from the computer when it comes to covering park news. And we were both at it, like, pretty much for this whole, holiday break that we've just come to the end of, or toward the end of, because there is so much going on.
We do keep busy with it, and my wife really worries that if I do retire, that I won't be able to retire because I'll just be sitting here wondering what's going on with the parks and what can I write about the parks.
You can't retire, Kurt. You just can't. So
just fade off into the distance. So over the years, there have been annual stories about the most endangered rivers in America, and there have been stories about the most endangered historic sites in America. And 5 years ago, the Travelers started taking a look at, should there be a series of stories looking at threatened and endangered units in the national park system, because certainly there are lots of threats that the parks face and the Park Service faces. I mean, you look at the Park Service by itself, and there's the staffing issue, there's the poor pay, the poor housing for Park Service employees, the decline in retention among National Park Service employees. Those are impacts that go right to the Park Service and its ability to manage all these places. At the same time, as you well know, Kim, you've written on it often and enough, there are pollution issues, there's oil and gas drilling issues. As you pointed out a couple of years ago, there's light pollution. I mean, there should be annual stories about the threats to national parks just because the parks belong to the American public. The American public deserves to know how these places are being managed, what threats exist out there, and how the Park Service can respond to those threats.
Agreed. And I'm always curious about the process by which these organizations, including the National Parks Traveler, decide on which places are going to get included on such a list, because the threats are so perennial to a certain extent. They're just, we could almost write the same series almost every year because, like you said, the threats to these parks have been going on for a long time and they're not easy solutions. So, so that might raise the question among some people, why even do this? But I think it's so important to shine a hot light on the plight of the parks. And I think the end of the year and the beginning of a new year is always a time to take stock. It's always a time to take stock in our personal lives. That's when everyone's signing up for their gym memberships or, making their New Year's resolutions. So I just always think that the passage of a new year is a good time to sort of take stock and think, where are we? What has gotten better? What has gotten worse? And take a look at it. Obviously, we're covering these stories all year long. We're talking about threats to parks all year long, but I really appreciate that we have adopted this model to take the opportunity to really shine a hot light on some, key issues, even if they feel like they're perennial or really hard to solve, or, might feel a little stuck sometimes. But, we have to cover them because they're important.
Well, you're absolutely right in that, we could write about the same parks and the same issues every year. I mean, Big Cypress is the poster child for the threat of oil exploration and oil production and what it would do to the landscape. Cape Hatteras National Seashore, Cape Lookout National Seashore, all the national seashores, we could write about them every year, about the threats posed by more potent storms and by sea level rise, air quality issues, commercial overflights. A lot of these issues are just, like you said, they're perennial. And we recognize that, and our list is not the de facto list of, here are the only parks that are threatened. Rather, I think our intention is to raise the issue and tie it to one specific park and list other parks that also have similar issues.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And I think the stories that the Traveler's going to be running seem pretty varied. So it's also just another opportunity to let readers know about the breadth of the national park system, which is, our mission all year long. But I think it's a great opportunity to say, hey, these are all these different places and they face myriad threats. And it's just really interesting to read about all the different things that the parks are dealing with.
Yeah, and we opened this series the other day with your piece on the Appalachian National Scenic Trail and the threats it faces that go to the core of what people hope the trail will be, no?
Yeah, I really appreciated the opportunity to write about that. One of the interesting things from my experience being a traveler reporter this year is that I've gotten to sink my teeth into some big stories that I think have made national news here on the East Coast where I am. And one of those, as you mentioned, was Cape Hatteras. I was there over the summer and wrote a series of 3 articles about different, things happening there that are impacting the visitor experience and the natural resources. But another story that was really important to me is that I went down to North Carolina just a couple weeks after Hurricane Helene went through and had significant impacts on Western North Carolina communities, as everybody across the country was well aware of, but especially to the national parks, the beloved national parks, Great Smoky Mountains and Blue Ridge Parkway, and the towns and economies that depend on those national parks. So it was just very meaningful to me as a journalist to be able to go to these places in person, to talk to people in person, and really understand what the issues are. But one place that I sort of left out of my Helene coverage when I ran my story, or when we ran the story in October about economic impacts from Helene on parkway towns, was the Appalachian Trail. And obviously that, follows the ridge well down through North Carolina and Southern Virginia. And it had significant impacts. And this is a beloved treadway, thousands of people have hiked on the AT. I mean, I think I've mentioned this in other podcasts over time, but the AT is so important to me personally, living in Virginia, where a major part of the AT goes through Virginia, that literally every time I step onto the AT, even if it's brief, like, because, in Shenandoah National Park, like the AT crisscrosses other trails and you might be on it for a few yards and then back off it. But every time I get on the AT and see the white blaze, I feel a little thrill. There's just something magical about this trail and knowing that it connects Maine to Georgia and has so much cultural and natural significance. So it's a very important place to me personally. And it's had significant impacts that major parts, miles, hundreds of miles or just over 100 miles now of trail are still closed from downed trees and other major impacts. And we had a lot to get our arms around in the initial story that we ran about the impacts from Helene. And of course, you were right on top of the news coverage as it was happening. So I'm referring to my feature story about the economic impacts, but I know the Traveler was right on top of the news coverage as it was happening. But I felt that the AT kind of got a little bit lost, as it did in the national press, in terms of the impacts to the trail. So I was really appreciative that this, Threatened and Endangered Park series gave us a chance to really focus on the AT, because not only is the trail itself in terms of its natural resources impacted, but the hiker experience in 2025 it remains to be seen how that will be impacted. I mean, through hikers may or may not be able to hike the whole distance the way they have in the past, depending on how quickly crews can clear debris and make sure the trail is safe. In some places, there may be complete washouts, like we saw at the Blue Ridge Parkway. So that was an interesting piece for me to write, and I was glad that I got a chance to focus on it.
You know, Kim, we're both writers, and we both argue, I think, about that saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. But I have to admit that the pictures that you were able to get from the Appalachian Trail Conservancy of the damage along the trail in North Carolina and in Virginia, just incredible. I mean, it really brings home the downed trees, and the trail is lost in places.
Yeah, the ATC, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, do incredible work as the prime partner of the National Park Service and in stewarding the Appalachian Trail across its entire length. And what I love about the Conservancy is they really focus not just on the treadway itself, but they focus on the whole landscape, all the landscape values, view sheds, habitat, forest fragmentation, and things like that. So, and what's really great about the Conservancy is that they are like the umbrella organization for all these on the ground trail clubs up and down the entire, 2,100 mile length of the AT. There are these on the ground trail clubs that really adopt these sections and help keep the trail safe and clear and, monitor conditions and report back. And so it was shocking to me, some of the pictures that they were able to get from crews working on parts of the Appalachian Trail, particularly around Mount Rogers in the southern part of Virginia where the AT crosses. And I was really struck, not just by the pictures, but when I interviewed Doug Levin, who's the trail coordinator for the Mount Rogers Trail Club, that he said that he's been volunteering there on the AT for a dozen or more years. And he spent more time working on the trail in November, December than he has at any other time in his history as a volunteer on the ground on the AT, just showing you the scope of the disaster and what they're dealing with. And as I also mentioned in my article, they don't normally even work in the winter. Usually, that at elevation, it's iced over, it's hard to get to, it's not something, the ground is frozen. So how much can you do if the ground is frozen? But because of the enormity of the task, and also because they're trying to have the trail be open and clear for the 2025 hiking season, they're going to take any mild day and try to get out there and work. And my hat's off to them. It's a big task.
Now, the gist of your story was not simply storm damage from Helene, but rather, the future of the trail and the integrity of the trail is under fire from numerous risks, right? Not just...
That's it. Yeah, exactly. Like it's kind of like as the AT goes, you can think about the entire Appalachian corridor goes, and it's one of the last bastions of connected habitat and forest land in the eastern seaboard. So it's an essential landscape, for many sort of ecosystem reasons. And it's suffering the effects of pollution in a highly developed area. Like development encroaches on all sides. All the big cities that are, sort of encroaching towards the trail. It deals with pollution, including light pollution, as you mentioned, but other kinds of pollution and climate change. Like I know there's been lots of concern about how climate change is changing the forest makeup. It makes the trail more vulnerable to invasive species. You have sort of disconnects with migrating birds where like maybe things are blooming at different times because of climate change. And so this entire like interconnected trailway, this corridor is threatened by a lot of different things. And then so it becomes, so the Helene, a storm like Helene really shines a spotlight on that because it creates a really huge acute problem to deal with on top of all these kind of thorny long-term problems that park managers are dealing with. So it's a lot for stewards like the Conservancy and others to be paying attention to, and the Park Service.
I wonder, light pollution obviously is a growing issue with urban sprawl, air pollution, acid rain. Are there other types of pollution that are impacting the trail?
Well, I mean, I think those are kind of the big ones. I always am concerned about clean water, for instance, clean water issues, clean air, perennial issues. I think habitat loss is a major concern. There are a lot of endangered species that rely on the Appalachian Trail corridor landscape, both plants and animals, including some in some of these highly impacted areas from this storm. One thing that's interesting is that the storm was so severe that, it's changed the tree canopy, and you have lots of downed trees. That's impacting habitat. It's impacting birds and other ground dwelling creatures. And, so it remains to be seen how that will all shake out. But I know there's some very vulnerable plant species that grow along the trail in Southern Virginia, for instance. So a lot of these major ecosystem concerns are at play here.
Another part of the series debuted on the Traveler this morning. Lori Sonkin, our contributing editor from upstate New York, wrote an incredible piece about the economic costs that visitors are facing when they go to visit a national park. And people might not think, well, that's not a threat to the parks. Well, it certainly is, because you need people to love the parks, to advocate for the parks, to visit the parks. Her piece centered on the cost of lodging in the national park system, and we've had some spot stories over the years looking at that. David and Kay Scott, our lodging experts, wrote a piece, I think it was in October, that showed how the costs of a room in a park lodge was higher than the consumer price index, was higher than hotel rates outside of the national parks, and just keeps going and going and going. Lori did a great job tracking down some visitors to the park system. This one woman, she and her family visited Glacier National Park from South Carolina last year, and they've been going to the park for years. She and her husband had been visiting national parks for more than 20 years, and Glacier has shown up on their top 5 list of favorite national parks. But last year they spent $4,600 on 3 rooms for 6 nights. They say they won't go back. They just can't afford it. As she told Lori, the higher costs this year won't stop us from going to others, but we will have to remain on a tight budget to keep traveling to the parks. When we started, we would have a week-long trip and not spend near what others spent going to Disney World with their families, but Glacier seemed much closer to the cost of going to a resort park. Another park visitor that Lori tracked down, Bruce Anderson, a retired U.S. Forest Service environmental planner who lives in southwestern Colorado. He told Lori, the parks are for everybody, but yet they're not, because they are pricing people out. You can get through the gate and you can do stuff and enjoy the park for relatively little money, but the lodging part, unless you're camping, the lodging's prohibitive. I'm surprised that the Park Service isn't taking note of this, or at least they don't seem to be taking note of it.
I hope they will after they read the story. Lori's such a fantastic reporter, and what I love about her writing is how she really finds great quotes, great people to interview, and people who can really speak to the heart of the issue. And it sounds like she's done that again. This is a big concern, and it's sad. I know that post-pandemic, cost of living has gone up for so many people in so many places, but it's really tricky and hard to hear that the national parks, which has always been so economical and kind of open to everyone, is becoming so cost prohibitive.
And one of the sad things, the Park Service response to this is, well, there's lodging that everybody can afford. You can find a cabin for $150 a night. Yeah, you can find a cabin for $150 a night, and it's not always a very nice cabin. The Park Service needs to do a lot of work in updating cabins, and a lot of that falls on the concessionaire, because often the Park Service writes these contracts saying, oh, by the way, here's a checklist for you to tackle once we give you this contract to manage lodging in the parks. It's a sad situation. What's also sad is the concessionaires are not willing to talk about this situation. Lori did the math. She looked at Glacier National Park. There were 114,718 stays and lodging at Glacier in 2023. All but 5,328 of those lodging units are managed by Xanterra Parks and Resorts, which is the park concessionaire. Now, if you assume that each stay costs a minimum of $150, and that's a weak assumption because many rooms cost more than $150, but let's just say that you base it on $150 a night, Xanterra would have received $16.4 million in revenues. Now, that's not all profit. We accept that. That's gross receipts. And Xanterra is required to pay a 2% franchise fee to the Park Service, as well as make a 2.35% annual contribution to a maintenance and reserve account. That's all well and good, but when you look at some of the nightly rates, I mean, next summer, Lori found that if you want to spend a night at the Many Glacier Hotel in Glacier National Park, in an area known as the Switzerland of North America, that's going to cost you $766 for one night.
That's pretty absurd for the average American, and maybe even for the not average American. I mean, what I was going to say about what you said earlier is that $150 a night might feel reasonable in this age of skyrocketing hotel costs, but that's out of reach for huge swaths of the American public, especially if you want to do more than one night, which you would have to do in a remote national park. So, that's just shutting the door, even if that, I live in Washington, D.C., or just outside D.C., in one of like a really high cost of living place. And the hotel rooms around where I live are pretty outrageous. It's like if I see a hotel room for under $200, I'd be shocked. But for a national park in a remote area like that, still feels really high to me, and it would be really out of reach for a lot of people. So,
well, you want to be shocked, Kim? And our listeners, I'm sure, will be shocked by this next factoid. Lori compiled a chart that shows prices next summer for some of the most expensive park lodging. Places like the Crater Lake Lodge at Crater Lake National Park, the Many Glacier Hotel, which we've mentioned, El Tovar at Grand Canyon, Jenny Lake Lodge at Grand Teton National Park, by the way, wins the award for the most expensive nightly rate at just about $2,000. The Paradise Inn at Mount Rainier, $312. Wasatch Lodge at Sequoia in Kings Canyon, $409 a night. Now, what Lori did with these numbers, she did some research. She found that most of these costs are more than what a stay at a hotel in New York City would cost. Of course, you don't have the same views as you do in New York City, but, park historians know that the debate in Congress over designating national parks, a lot of the argument for creating national parks was these lands are worthless. They're no good for anything. We might as well turn them into parks and let people walk through them. And now the Park Service is allowing these nightly rates to be set for a national park system that the public owns.
Yeah, and it's pretty much going to shut out, whole groups of people from going to the national parks. And, especially when I think about socioeconomic diversity and, the ability of certain groups that this is completely priced out. And if you think about sort of underrepresented groups in the national parks who maybe just don't have a lot of camping experience or don't have a whole attic full of camping gear, like they're not going to be the ones to go, hey, sure, I feel comfortable going off backpacking through Glacier. It's making a lot of assumptions about who the average park goer is and what they're capable of. And I think it's kind of making it that average park goer a very elite person. And it's kind of the opposite of what we want the national parks to be. I'm not saying there's kind of one be all end all answer to this, but it just doesn't feel like what the mission of the National Park Service should be. So,
no, I mean, the Park Service worries about diversity in the parks and equity, and these costs are just getting out of control. I don't know what the answer is either. I mean, maybe the Park Service should take over management of the hotels and the lodges. The Park Service can be argued they don't have the expertise to do that. I don't know. We could continue on this discussion for another hour or two, Kim, but we should probably move on to some of the other stories in the Threatened and Endangered Parks series. We mentioned early on that, we looked across the country and looked at different issues that have come up. And while you've written a lot about sea level rise and more potent storms and their impacts on places like Cape Hatteras National Seashore, Justin Hausman, our new associate editor, has put together a piece on what sea level rise is doing to national park units on the West Coast. And one of the parks he focused on was on Point Reyes National Seashore and how sea level rise is actually impacting elephant seals, if you can believe that. We had a podcast in December about elephant seals and how they come to Point Reyes National Seashore in the winter months for breeding and for giving birth. And the problem that Justin found is that these more potent storms in the Pacific and sea level rise is cutting short the beaches that the elephant seals come to for this breeding and mating and relaxing in the winter months. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens there in the long run. There's also issues with erosion at Olympic National Park, beach erosion. There's a fabulous oceanside trail that you can hike, and the Park Service is facing issues on how to maintain that trail in the face of erosion and more potent storms. Another piece that you wrote, talking about more potent storms, focused on parks in the Southeast, and you've mentioned some of them. What did you find? What's driving that story?
What I found really interesting about reporting that story is that there's just a lot of science happening, which is good. There's a lot of scientific research that's focusing on why storms are becoming more intense. But the sort of scientific conclusion is that these major storm events like hurricanes and tornadoes are getting more intense, across the country, but also especially in the Southeast, as we just saw in the 2024 season. I interviewed a climate scientist from the nonprofit organization Climate Central. They just released a study this year that showed that every Atlantic hurricane in 2024 was stronger than it might have been without the impacts of climate change. Every single one. And there's a new science called attribution science that helps scientists to determine the extent to which climate change is impacting these major storm events. They can't say with exact pinpoint accuracy, but they can determine to a certain level whether climate change is really impacting this or that storm. And that's been the case, that this science showed that all storms in 2024 were stronger than they would have been otherwise without the existence of climate change, which I found very, very interesting. And two of the named hurricanes, Beryl and Milton in 2024, were pushed into Category 5 territory because of the impacts of climate change. And it's all related to warming oceans. Warming oceans lead to more water vapor. More water vapor in the air creates more energy in the atmosphere that fuels storms. It's like pumping a storm with gasoline, and then they make landfall and they're stronger and more intense than they would have been otherwise. Another thing I wrote about in my piece was the phenomenon of rapid intensification, which I didn't really understand before I reported this piece, which is when a storm literally spins up and increases its maximum wind speeds over a very short amount of time. The measure is usually 24 hours. And so almost all of the Atlantic storms also underwent rapid intensification, and the number of storms experiencing this is increasing. I mean, scientists have just seen this. They're modeling this, they're tracking this. And what that means is that these storms are less predictable. So you have stronger storms that are less predictable because they're spinning up in different ways. They intensify more rapidly. That means that people don't have as much time to react to these storms. Wildlife doesn't have as much time to react to these storms, and ecosystems as a whole just are battered without any way of sort of being able to withstand these on a regular basis. So it's becoming a major, major issue. And it was very interesting to read about. I'd sort of heard about worsening storms for a long time, but it was interesting to really delve into some of the science behind it.
You wrote a lot about Helene and the damage it did to the Blue Ridge Parkway, specifically in North Carolina. And of course, you wrote about the Appalachian Trail and the impacts there. Were you able to get a hold of any Park Service personnel to talk about how they're viewing these storms and the concerns they have over parks like Shenandoah or Great Smoky Mountains, or you go down into Everglades or Cumberland Island National Seashore? Do they have increased concerns over what these storms mean to those parks?
Well, I haven't reached the head of the climate department for the Park Service yet, who is the main person I want to talk to. I did talk with a park ranger at Fort Pulaski National Monument, which is right there on the shore, right near Savannah, Georgia, near Tybee Island. It's a coastal park. It's a very significant historic resource. This fort, which has a ditch and dike system that has just seen a lot of flooding, a lot of saltwater incursion, and the park ranger did point to me to a project underway right now by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to kind of retrofit at least one of these ditches to deal with saltwater. But so that was one park person I talked to, but I am still hoping to talk to the head of the climate change office for the Park Service to get kind of a global perspective on what's happening with these storms. And I hope to update the story if I can reach that person. Granted, it's been the holidays the last couple weeks. I did talk to Dr. Patrick Gonzalez, who is the former head climate science for the National Park Service, and he was very helpful in raising concerns and saying that the Park Service, at least when he was there, was well aware of this trend towards worsening storm impacts. And the Park Service has done, some work to determine vulnerability of parks to worsening storms, kind of on a park by park basis and kind of on a regional basis. But I definitely still hoping to get some more current commentary from the Park Service if I can.
Yeah, hopefully they'll come through with that. It's interesting. The Park Service does try and respond to these things. And a perfect example you and I know firsthand is down at Everglades National Park in Flamingo, where there used to be a beautiful lodge there. And back-to-back hurricanes, I think it was in 2005, basically trashed that hotel, that lodge. And it took forever to come up with a sound plan to return lodging to Flamingo. And what the concessionaire did was basically put the lodging on stilts. What was it, 10-foot pillars that they put the lodgings on?
That's a wise thing to do, but, that can only get you so far. I'm thinking back to all the houses that have fallen into the ocean at Cape Hatteras because of, sea level rise and beach erosion. All those houses are on stilts also. They were built on stilts because of ocean overwash, which has been a perennial thing on those barrier islands. But the ocean encroaches, the barrier island continues to shift, and these things are happening kind of on a more advanced pace now. And it's been a remarkable thing to watch, just house after house go into the sea at Cape Hatteras, and I expect more of that to happen. Especially next year, or this year, I should say. So
you have to wonder. You have to wonder if one of these years Cape Hatteras will be no more. But there's a perfect scientific observation I think you can make on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, because you've got Cape Lookout and Cape Hatteras, and Cape Hatteras is very built out as opposed to Cape Lookout, which isn't built out. Some years ago, there was a hurricane that resulted in 50 breaches in the barrier islands at Cape Lookout National Seashore. And I believe all those breaches have healed on their own. And so the barrier island there has been very resilient. At Cape Hatteras, they're kind of fighting nature with Highway 12 that comes down there, because every year storms come through and wash out sections of the highway or just bury it under sand.
I think what we're going to be seeing in the coming years, and especially in the coming decades, is that the park system as we know it will not look the same. I think we're seeing some reshaping of the land even as we speak. And you mentioned that trail along the edge of Point Reyes, or was it the one in Oregon?
Olympic.
Right. Oh, an Olympic. Sorry,
Washington.
Okay. Well, you mentioned that trail in Washington and how, park managers are figuring out how to maintain it. But, at some point they might say, hey, we can't maintain this oceanside trail. It just isn't going to happen. So I think a lot of parks are going to have to shift, as the climate shifts and as the landscape shifts. And it's going to be interesting to watch.
Another story is coming from Rita Beamish. She writes wonderful pieces, and she's been looking at how hard rock mining could impact the national parks and oil exploration. And her focus is on Alaska, because there's been a lot of talk about mining up there, whether it's the Pebble Mine proposal outside of Lake Clark National Park and Preserve, or the Ambler Road, which would cut across Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. and I think cross the Noatak River to reach a supposedly world-class copper deposit. And so you've got the desire for mining and the impacts that it would bring to national parks. You know, people in the past have criticized our podcast and some of our coverage because it weighs into politics. And unfortunately, we have to do it. You can't avoid talking about politics because political decisions directly impact the national parks and the National Park Service when it comes both to Park Service funding and staffing, as well as natural resource degradation. It's going to be interesting. The Biden administration blocked the Ambler Road. They refused to give them the necessary permits, said it wasn't proven to be an economic viability. And you've got the incoming Trump administration that is saying drill, baby, drill, and they're friendly with mining interest. And so I got a bad feeling that there's going to be a lot of battles over the Ambler Road and its possible impacts to Gates of the Arctic.
Yeah, I'm always interested when people say, "Oh, I'm not interested in politics," or "I don't do politics." And I think, well, politics is doing you and affecting you whether you want to admit it or not. So you're right. We have to wade into those waters sometimes, and it's not always easy. But what I've always appreciated about you and the Traveler is that you're also not afraid to take, anyone to task, regardless of what party they're in, even if you perceive a certain administration to be more or less friendly. Like, the Traveler is always willing to take a hard look at who's running the show, such as Chuck Sams, our Park Service director. I know you had an editorial about his legacy over the last few years in the Park Service, and taking a hard look at that. So I think that will continue, that we will be taking a hard look at the people running the show and what their values are and what they're doing to help the parks. I mean, that is our mission. We can't say that we're here totally not interested, without an interest in what the outcome of the national parks are. We are biased in that way. We care about these places and we want them to be taken care of. We've just outed our bias. So that, if we are biased in any way, I think it's on behalf of the national park system and wanting to make sure that it's protected in perpetuity, just like the original Park Service, managers said it would be.
No, it's going to be interesting to see the Interior Department and the Park Service under the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, because during the first Trump administration, there was not a Senate-confirmed Park Service director. They used a musical chairs, so to speak, of acting directors coming in and going out, and we didn't see a lot of good park policy at the time. If you remember, in 2018, going into 2019, there was a partial government shutdown, and they decided they were going to keep the national parks open even if the Park Service couldn't go to work, and we saw a lot of trash and damage across some of the parks. It was unfortunate. I think the Park Service needs a really strong director to push back against some of the political decisions and have a strong voice for natural resources and a strong National Park Service. Because these are important places, they are essential places for so many different reasons. I know I like to escape to them not only for the recreational benefits, but to get away from emails and texts and all that kind of stuff. And I know you like the same things.
Sure do. I was sitting here thinking, what national parks am I going to in 2025? And I don't have anything lined up just yet. And we'll see where you send me this year. So that'll be interesting. My family and I are planning to go to Iceland this summer. So if you're interested in a story on Iceland's national park system, I might be able to gin one up for you. They have 3 national parks in that small country. So I'm very interested in that. But I am also interested in seeing what parks I can get out to this year. Just like you, there are places, it's both personal and professional. Like, I want to see what's happening there, but I also want to get away, unplug, walk through the woods, breathe deeply, do all those things.
Well, I'm certainly hoping that you're going to get down to Jamestown, historic Jamestown, and Colonial National Historical Park in your backyard, basically.
Yep, that's on the agenda for sure.
There are some good stories there. I'm contemplating driving across the country in late spring to go back east to your backyard. I'm going to swing up into New Jersey. I've got a sister-in-law who lives in Virginia. Hope to visit her too. But I'm thinking about driving across the country to take a a more slow journey and visit some of the places we don't frequently go to. And, I did that a couple of years ago when I went across Kansas and Nebraska and really discovered some beautiful parks that had great stories to tell and were really enjoyable. And I think that's what we all have to do is, yes, there are the Yellowstones and the Grand Canyons out there that definitely on your must-do checklist, but there's other places that we need to explore. I know being based in the Rocky Mountains, one of the places I'm thinking about doing is going down to some of the parks that have rich Native American history, ancestral Puebloans, and you look at Chaco Culture National Historical Park, and I think that's the ground central for the ancestral Puebloans. But then they had all these parks. Well, they didn't have parks, but they had destinations, within a few days' travel that they had communities grow up, and these places are now protected in the national park system. And I thought it'd be really interesting to try and pull together a story looking at the flow of people across those places.
That sounds great. And in my storm story, I mentioned a tiny park in Florida called DeSoto National Monument, which is still entirely closed. It has not reopened after Hurricanes Helene and Milton. And I have yet to really understand why, whether it's a staffing issue or what's happening there. It's something I still hope to find out. But now that I know about this little park, which forgive me for not really knowing about it, I'm kind of curious about it. So I'll be keeping tabs on whether this park opens anytime soon and what it's all about. It's just one of so many small, undiscovered little gems in the park system that are worth visiting and checking out. So I look forward to doing some of that too.
Yeah, I know they had a lot of flood damage from, I think it was Milton. I'm not sure if Helene hit them directly or not. But
it didn't hit them directly, but the outer bands did impact them, believe it or not. Even though we think of Helene as more of a Georgia, North Carolina swath, they're right on the tip in the Gulf Coast. And Helene knocked them, and it was like a 1-2 punch is kind of how I envision it. And then Milton really is the one that had a major impact because that's basically where Milton made landfall.
Well, and also I hope to send you back to the Blue Ridge Parkway to find out how things are going in North Carolina, because with all the landslides they had there, they're talking lots and lots of money to repair them, and it's not going to happen overnight, is it?
No, definitely. And I know we talked about this on another podcast, but, I interviewed Bruce O'Connell, the manager of the Pisgah Inn, right on the Blue Ridge Parkway, not too far from Asheville. And I asked him, about how things were going. And he said, I hope I can open on April 1, and that's going to be very many months since the storm passed at that point. That's their normal opening date for the Parkway season. So I'll definitely be wanting to check back with him and see whether the inn is going to be on track to open on time for the 2025 season or not.
Well, I think you should check back with him and make a room reservation, because it'll be a great base camp to explore, many of the sites that you visited in November and what they look like today and what they're looking like down the road.
Well, you'll have to let me know when you're passing through Virginia, and maybe we can meet up at a park somewhere.
There you go. We'll do the Appalachian Trail. Well, Kim, thanks so much for joining me today. It's been a provocative at times conversation, and I really can't stress enough to the listeners out there how important the Threatened and Endangered Park series is. I know some people might think it's superfluous or it's too politically motivated. Neither of those are true. It is just taking a look at these incredible places, beautiful places, rich in history and culture, and how they're being managed and how they need to be managed to allow future generations to enjoy them.
Thanks a lot for having me, Kurt.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. Watch the Traveler website for our ongoing series from the 4th annual Threatened and Endangered Parks package. Next week, we'll be talking about the 30 years that have passed since wolves were returned to Yellowstone National Park in an effort to make the ecosystem's wild kingdom whole again. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repanshek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, These musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.